And right now, I am delighted to pass the reins over to Nancy Gerzon, a researcher for the Regional Educational Laboratory Northeast Islands. Thank you all so much for joining.
Thank you, Rebby. So glad to be here today and to have an opportunity to share with you some work that we've been doing at the Regional Education Lab, Northeastern Islands, and also some strong new connections that we're making between the data use work that we're doing and the early warning system work that Nashville has been involved with over the last several years. So I'm Nancy Gerzon, as Rebby said, and I'm a researcher at REL Northeastern Islands, and my area of focus is on data use and formative assessment work. I've been working about the last 15 years supporting schools and districts to use data, and I'm the author of one of the REL guides, which we'll talk about in a little while, that sets up the framework for the work that we're going to be talking about today. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Margie Johnson from Metropolitan Nashville Public Schools, where she works in the district offices leading data use practices at the school level. Dr. Canidra Henderson, who is an executive principal at Haynes Middle School, and is here to share with us today how she and Dr. Johnson have worked together at the school level to support teachers to use early warning system data at the middle school level in a proactive and highly responsive way to look across their system at needs and to help teachers think about what are some of the things that they can do proactively to support students who have early warning system flags. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Stephanie Wilkerson, who is a co-researcher in one of the RELs, in the REL Appalachia, and she's worked closely with Nashville Public Schools to help them develop some guidance and supports, in particular working with them on developing a system of supports for teachers to use data effectively in the classrooms. In thinking about their involvement with us today, we are organized around helping think about a couple of different elements on today's webinar. We're going to focus on some research that we've looked closely at on how to support a culture of data use in schools and districts, and take some time to unpack the 5 elements of the culture of data use framework and think about how they connect to early warning systems and early warning system implementation in schools. And then we're going to look at that from a district and school perspective, and beginning with Dr. Johnson talking about how Metro Nashville has approached this from implementing key data use practices at the district level, and then Dr. Henderson will have an opportunity to talk about work that's been done at the school level, and Dr. Wilkerson will have an opportunity to talk about how the REL has supported that and what we can think about in terms of early warning system broader implementation at using data at the school and district level. So we organized that today for those of you who are interested in learning about the time. We'll start off with the research perspective, move into district and then school level use. And when we end, I wanted to mention that we have a summary of strategies for local implementation that will be shared during the Nashville presentation, but our goal is to pull those out and kind of realign them and organize around what you can do from a strategic level in order to support each of these 5 elements in the culture of data use framework and develop more consistent data use practices. So just a few things to start. First, I need to tell you that I was taught as a very, very young child never to interrupt people when they were speaking. And so everything I'm about to say, I can just already see my parents cringing. Please interrupt us during the presentation. We know that this isn't a cultural norm when we're together, but on webinars it works particularly well, both from the standpoint of giving us questions and also having an opportunity for you all to talk with each other about some of the things that you're hearing, which we strongly encourage. We have a team of folks who are going to be working behind the scenes to help organize questions. So if there's lots of things happening in the chat, we won't miss them. We'll get to them. And if there's, as various folks are speaking, others of us will be able to join in there and be part of that conversation as well. So you can, if that's a cultural norm that doesn't work well for you, be like me and try it today. And we know that it does work. The Urban School Improvement Alliance and the Rural School Improvement Alliance asked us to help them think about what the research said around what is a culture of data use. And we were asked specifically to develop a set of resources for the district and school leaders so that they could enhance or further develop the cultures at their site and really support this idea of ongoing continuous improvement using data. So we developed at that time a workshop toolkit, and it's a little bit of a research dissemination project where we took a very close look at the research, and we'll talk about the 76 studies that we used to review in terms of thinking about what was out in the field doing that. And we developed, between that and looking at some work that many of us on the team had done in districts and schools, we developed a one-day workshop format that's in this guide that you see in front of you. And the goal of that workshop format is to use research summaries, case studies, vignettes, self-assessment tools to identify your current data use practices and to consider this concept of a framework to help leaders develop a more strategic approach to the different aspects of data work that need to be done in schools for that to be successful. When the early warning webinar series was originally being developed, the Regional Education Lab in the Northeast Islands was asked to include some of this work because it has a strong basis in how to best disseminate data use practices at schools. Again, it's not a how-to guide. It's much more of a leadership guide to help people think about the strategic areas where they need to focus. But this framing of how this can support early warning system work was an important frame for us because, and I just need to say this up front in the webinar, our original framing for this particular research and set of materials for our alliances was very much guided by what's good in data use practices and not necessarily where are we with early warning system design. But we strongly believe, and I believe that you'll feel the same way at the end of this webinar today when you hear from Nashville, that there's a really nice natural intersection of the work that guides the framing, the research that frames the work that we did for this toolkit, and the work that Nashville did, which is a parallel set of practices that align beautifully with the toolkit elements and can serve to raise the volume on how to approach some of the key areas in the framework. And so let's go into the research a little bit, but first I'd like Jenny to put up a poll. And this poll is an opportunity for you to be thinking about, when I think of the early warning system in my own district or school, data is analyzed most frequently by district leaders, district data coordinators, school administrators, school early warning system teams, teachers. Those are your choices. So we're going to pause for just a moment here and see where folks are. And I will tell you that the rationale behind this poll is that sometimes when we go into schools, I primarily do professional development, even though I am a REL researcher. I have found that oftentimes there is one smaller group of folks who is using data. And this has been particularly true with early warning system designs. So in many places where we work, the organizer is that there is a particular team. It might be school administrators. It might be a school-based early warning team. It might be some district leaders working. In this case, it looks like there's evenness, a little bit of evenness here in the three center pieces. District data coordinators, school administrators, and school early warning system teams seem to have the predominance, if you add those up, of groups that are working on their early warning data. And I'd mention importantly that fewer people identified teachers as the primary source of data analysis and use for early warning systems. And Jenny, you can take the poll down now, thank you. One of the things that we want to raise up as we talk about this work is this issue of kind of who all is looking at the data? And when I say that with this sort of sing-songy voice, it's really a big question that we ask when we go in. Who is looking at the data? And so we came to this idea when we were looking around the research and saying, what does it mean to have a culture of data use? Well, culture of data use means primarily that that's what's happening. Data use is happening, and that kind of means it's happening by everyone. A few years ago, at one of our REL Bridge events, Jeff Wayman, who's an esteemed colleague researcher in the field of data use, identified this concept that when we think about data culture, we want to see that data is used as something that happens when nobody else is looking, and that there's an energy around that. One of the earliest sort of references to data culture in the field was in 2005 when Margaret Heritage and Ray Yeagley wrote in one of their data use textbooks that in a culture of data use, what you hear educators saying is that using data is just the way we do things around here. So if you think back to our poll, the framing of having, sometimes groups of folks primarily responsible for that data use practice is a challenge if we want to think about the fact that a culture of data use is disseminating data use practices throughout the organization so that as folks are having an opportunity to think about that practice and use this for instructional improvement, it's happening in the regular way of doing business in the school. And it's just there as part of that daily work of teaching and learning and improvement. That helps us think about this idea of the culture of data use and our work on the research aspect of this. Because it's certainly the case that over the last 15 or 20 years, we've developed a fairly significant body of research that looks at educational data use practices. We have some important summaries that have been done. We have a lot of research about what's happening inside of schools, what does good collaborative inquiry look like, things like that. But we have very little that gives us a roadmap to really think about what are the actual characteristics of, or how do you get there? What are the specific ways that you could do that? What's the roadmap that we need? And in our thinking about this, we know, for example, that the knowledge and skills that are necessary to turn a data finding into an instructional action is something that teachers tell us is really, really hard. This requires knowledge of their students. It requires knowledge of curriculum, deep content knowledge, pedagogical skills, and the right sort of sets of interpretive frameworks to be able to make that transition or that translation from understanding data findings to moving something out into an instructional change or a practice change to do that. And we know that that has to happen in collaborative teams, and we know that's a big part of it, but that's only one small part of data analysis and use. And we know that in some schools, and I've been an example of this, but there's also really good examples in the research. There's a great study by Little and Horn in 2010 that looked at this, that you can have the same professional development, the same leadership, the same data sets that folks are working with, and in the same school, you could have one team that uses collaborative practices in really astoundingly important ways and moves the dial on student learning, and you can have another team where teachers are so upset by what happens in the data teams that they retreat into more privatized practice and less collaborative practice overall. And so we really wanted to think about that as we were looking at this culture of data use framework. What are the things that help make for consistent, daily, everyday use of data to guide improvement? And the research says that there are 5 elements. Now, you'll notice in this framework that it isn't a how-to guide. This is a guide that's really designed to organize around sort of a strategic approach to decision-making as leaders move forward in making decisions about what they need to develop a culture of data use. So the purpose of this framework is to provide a mental map to district and school leaders and to professional development providers so that they can make good strategic decisions about supporting their teachers. We began the development of this framework through the analysis of 6 different research syntheses. One of those was the IES Using Achievement Data to Support Instructional Decision-Making Guide, which came out in 2009. And that provided kind of an overview that was similar to this, but we wanted to pull in some other research syntheses to see. And what we found is that there's a lot of consistency in the field about these 5 elements being the key elements that you would want to see in a data use system that supports teachers. And I realized as I was going through my notes this morning that really what we have is sort of we have this side of the framework here, which looks at the idea of communication and communicating systems. So this left-hand column. We have this side over here on the right, which looks at the development of teacher knowledge and skills to support data use. And then at the base, we have this leadership piece. What are the elements within leadership that support and nurture data use to develop that cultural practice of using data to inform instruction and improvement? And as we look at today's speakers, we have a focus on the systems work here on the left, the communication and systems work, which primarily Dr. Johnson will be speaking about. We have this work on the right around supporting teachers and developing systems of support for teacher practice, which primarily Dr. Wilkerson will be speaking about. And then we have this notion of leadership. And though Dr. Henderson will be speaking about her work around different framework elements, this notion of her role as a building level leader to support this work at the middle school level is really a nice frame. So you can think about and listen for those things as I describe each of these elements. So starting here up on the upper right, I'll start right in this category here. Providing resources and assistance to make meaning of data speaks to the routines and protocols that sites develop for collaborative inquiry. And data use is at its heart a process of interpretation. And so it's clear from the research that with the right structures and improvement goals in place, that teachers benefit from this collaborative practice and student learning can improve with the right set of inquiry structures that are established. There was a fantastic study from Nelson, Slavin, and Duell in 2012 that introduced an important element in this bin and this element here that organizes around this notion of proving versus improving. And in schools that are more successful for data use, teachers talk about improving their practice rather than proving what was done right in their classrooms. So big switch in terms of how we focus the conversations in those categories and thinking about the supports that teachers need for collaborative inquiry. Going down the right-hand column then and looking at providing professional development on data use knowledge and skills, this is something that's near and dear to my heart as a professional development provider, knowing how difficult it is for teachers to translate data into action. And this, the work in this particular area for me, focuses on pedagogical content literacy and content knowledge development of teachers. That one of the ways that schools need to think about their data use work is to help teachers deepen and extend their content knowledge from the perspective of what are next appropriate steps for students? What are the range of instructional strategies that I can use to move learning forward based on the data? And how do I help make that transition between what happens above here in our discussions about what the data says and what needs to happen there? As we move forward into the participating in the flow of information, many urban schools especially invest in data systems, and this is an important frame for, I should say many urban schools do, this is an important frame for many systems get stuck here by focusing extensively on the system itself. What we know in this bin around participating in the flow of information is that data systems need to really develop streamlined, accessible uses, and as Marsh said in his 2007 research on this, that we want to see in this category that data is safe, usable, and easily digestible. And the responsibility of whoever it is that's preparing data for teachers, because teachers will tell us that they don't often prepare the data themselves, it's often prepared for them, important piece of that. As we think about developing a common vision for data use across a district, the principal's ability in this communicating professional expectations for data is the principal's responsibility for organizing and filtering information to bring that down to the teacher level is really critically important. And those communicating professional expectations happen in kind of soft and not soft ways in moving that forward. And we'll hear a little bit about how Nashville has done that in a variety of different ways. And finally, providing leadership involves being transparent with data and really helping teachers in particular and users of data understand that leadership is there to guide improvement. And the benefits from these informal distributed leadership strategies are very clear in the research about providing teacher leaders with access to data and opportunities to use that data. So that's the framework in a nutshell, and I'm going to close with one piece of guidance as you think about this through today's webinar. And that is that all 5 of these elements are equally important. And we can't privilege one over the other when we set up our systems of support for data. This metaphor I bring to you in this regard is organized around something that happened to me as a young person. And little did I know that it would be such a big topic right now, that we'd be doing this presentation during the Olympics and everybody's talking about gymnastics in the press. When I was a child, I was a gymnast, and I was a decent gymnast, but I was really hoping to be a much better gymnast. And I had a fantastic coach who recognized that there are basically 5 elements of gymnastics practice that I needed to work on: flexibility, endurance, stamina, strength, and poise. And those were her 5 frames for our practice. And I was super flexible, and because I was super flexible, all I wanted to do was work on things that were going to improve my flexibility. We like to do what we're good at. And she took all of that work right out of my practice, and she made me focus on the things that I wasn't as good at and that I needed to strengthen and develop. And all 5 were equally important to bring my scores up and to really make me proud of the work that I was able to do by developing those other areas that were weaker. And so I turn this over to Margie Johnson, who's going to talk about their areas of strength, where they started, and what they've done to improve other areas in the gymnastics metaphor as they've done this work in Nashville. So over to you, Margie.
Thank you, Nancy. So hello, everyone. I'm Margie Johnson. I work with Nashville Metropolitan School District as the Business Intelligence Coordinator. I'll talk a little more about my role as I go through the presentation. So just to give you a little bit of context, we are the 42nd largest school district in the U.S. We serve almost 88,000 students, and many people don't necessarily think of Metro Nashville as being diverse, but we are a diverse city with over 100 languages spoken, and we span across approximately 160 buildings. So think about the Titanic and you can think about us. We were fortunate to be awarded Race to the Top funding, and if you recall, the Race to the Top funding focused on 4 areas, and of course one of those areas was data systems. And we did use Race to the Top funding to kind of bring down some of the data silos that we had in place by creating a data warehouse. Now, of course, the technology is great, but as Nancy said, you have to have some other elements in place. And when we think about a data system, and if any of you have heard my boss, Laura Hansen, talk, she talks about processes, technology, and people. So we did use the Race to the Top funding to shore up the technology piece by building a data warehouse. And then we were fortunate that our Research Assessment and Evaluation Department collaborated with Dr. Balfonts at Johns Hopkins University to not only have our data warehouse to bring down the data silos, but to embed the early warning system within our data warehouse. So they have processes in there that will flag students with 1, 2, or 3 at-risk flags. And I'll talk a little more later about exactly what those flags are as we look at a report, and you'll see how some of the reports identify those flags. And of course, the people part of the early warning system is sometimes the piece of the puzzle that gets left out. And as Nancy said, the 5 elements of support of culture of data use, it's not directly, linked to early warning system, but if you think of a data system as processes, technology, and people, then the people part is what makes up the culture of data use. And that's really what I was hired to do as the business intelligence coordinator, is building people's role or building people's capacity to use data for making informed decisions so that we could support all of our students and they can be successful. So Nancy gave us a nice overview of the 5 elements. As you look at these 5 elements, we're going to do a really quick poll just to find out which element do you feel that is strongest right now in your organization. So if we'll go to the poll, we forgot to warn you that you would be actively engaged. I know sometimes we get on a webinar and we sit back and do multitask, but we want to hear from you. Which of these elements is strongest in your organization? I was going to say professional development was winning, and then it looks like communicating professional expectations. We'll give everyone just a little more time to respond. And also going back to Nancy's analogy about the gymnast, you want to start with what your strength is, but we'll talk about ideas for developing the other areas. All right. So it looks like we have communicate professional expectations, and then we have some professional development in place. So let's end this poll. There we go. Okay. So again, going back to the 5 elements, Nancy talked about how our work was kind of parallel. And as she was doing the research around those 5 elements, I was also researching data use practices and doing a needs assessment of our organization. And as a result, we developed the MNPS data-informed decision-making ecosystem. And I used to call it a framework, and then I realized, kind of like Nancy said, all the elements have to work together. So I think of it as an ecosystem. We have to work to balance the ecosystem. And I needed a mental map just for me so that I could explain to people, because, they're like, business intelligence coordinator, what's that? But this mental map it helps me explain to people kind of the work that I'm doing, and then it also gives me kind of the mental map of, okay, here's where I'm going, the vision of where I'm going. And really, this ecosystem encompasses all 5 elements of the culture of data use. So when we think about translating, theory to practice, this was kind of how we translated it here in Metro Nashville Public Schools. So you'll see the culture of collaborative inquiry is at the heart. We have the common language, data literacy and analysis, and then data access. And I'm going to briefly talk about each one and how they correlate to the 5 elements. So at the heart is the culture of collaborative inquiry. Again, if you look at the research, the bridge between data and results is collaborative inquiry. And this element really, it probably correlates with a couple of them, but I'm going to point out the correlation between providing leadership to nurture a culture of data use. Culture does not happen overnight, and we all know the importance, that role that leaders play in actually setting the tone for the culture. And again, if you look at the research from Nancy Love and her team, they provide us a definition of collaborative inquiry where stakeholders come together to understand problems, test solutions, and have reflective dialogue. And later in the presentation, you'll even see how here at MNPS we took this, again, kind of a research definition, and we translate it into more of a working definition. And Canidra will also probably talk more about, okay, collaborative inquiry, that's a great definition, but what does it look like, again, in practice at the school level? So another component of our ecosystem is data access, and as I said earlier, we were fortunate that we used the Race to the Top funding to build a data warehouse, and this slide just shows you a sample of some of the reports that we have. We have over 100 different reports. Instead of purchasing a software from a vendor, we actually hired developers to develop it. And I think one of the differentiating factors of our data warehouse is how user-centric it is. I'm sorry, my throat's getting chopped up. While we initially built some reports that were student-centered, the other reports were really developed by collaborating with our users, because all staff in our district have access to the data warehouse based on, their security roles. And as different questions would come up throughout the district, if they didn't like how the data was reported, then we would meet as a team with the programmers and say, here's the question we're trying to answer, here's how we would like it to be displayed. And we really call them the Wizard of Oz, because I don't know how they do it, but they work their magic in the background, and they would create the report, to answer the question that we were asking. And then, of course, when we worked with Dr. Balfont with our early warning system, then they would just add that to certain reports. Now, this report that you see on the screen is each school gets a dashboard, and this dashboard is a high-level, overview. And one of the things on here, I know it's really small, but we're going to zoom in here in a minute, but right here are our at-risk indicators. Close to this arrow right there. And if you remember, and I'll go ahead and zoom in. If you remember, I said that we worked with Dr. Balfont, and here at MNPS, 3 indicators were identified. The one indicator is around discipline. So if a student in kindergarten through 4th grade has 2 or more in-school suspensions or out-of-school suspensions, or for our students 5th grade through high school, 12th grade, if they have more than 5 out-of-school suspensions, then that would trigger the discipline flag. We also have a flag for attendance. For our K through 4, if their attendance falls below 90%, then it would trigger an at-risk flag. And then for our middle school through high school students, if their attendance fell below 85%, it would trigger an at-risk flag. Now, in our middle and high schools, we also have a 3rd flag, which is 1 failing grade. In elementary school, we didn't. That didn't seem to be a big indicator in elementary school. And here you can see it says at-risk flags, how many, and then the number, and then that's a hyperlink. So our schools can click on that number 15 and actually get a list of the students with 1 flag and then 2 flag and then a 3 flag. And the other report that you're seeing is we created virtual data wall cards for every student in our district. So if you click on the 15 and you notice student Garafias is at risk, well, then you can go to their virtual data wall card and see exactly what the at-risk indicator is. Again, we work with programmers. We call them the Wizard of Oz because we're very fortunate to have them generate these reports. But again, having the technology in place, we also have to build people's capacity around the data literacy and analysis. And for this part of the ecosystem, and I was fortunate enough to be introduced to Dr. Jenny Rankin in March of 2013, where she shared with me some work that she was doing around over-the-counter data standards. And one of the key standards that we adopted here in MNPS is around supplemental documentation. And you'll see a sample data guide there on the screen. And the data guides are embedded within our data warehouse. So when you generate a report, if there's a data guide, you can click on that data guide, and it will tell you some questions that report answers, the focus, if there's a warning around that, so that we can minimize misinterpretations of the data, and then just kind of gives an overview of all the acronyms. In education, we like to use acronyms, so I always try to address all the acronyms. We also, this spring, developed a collaborative inquiry toolkit. We did a pilot, which Haynes Middle was one of our pilot schools, but they wanted to be called a community of practice around collaborative inquiry, and one of their requests was that we build a toolkit to help provide that just-in-time, professional development as they were working with their teams, because we do have common planning teams, or planning time throughout the district. This collaborative inquiry toolkit is built upon the innovation configuration map, which Dr. Stephanie Wilkerson will be talking about here in just a few moments, a little more detail about. But I wanted to mention this toolkit because you are welcome to go to our Collaboration Corner blog, and if you'd like to get updates about the work that we're doing here throughout the district, you're more than welcome to subscribe to that. And then through that community of practice, again, taking that theory to practice, the 9 schools now that are part of our community of practice have developed a working definition of collaborative inquiry as the database team process. We've adopted the collaborative learning cycle from Dr. Laura Lipton and Bruce Wellman, and we marry that with the qualities of effective groups. And then the last part of our ecosystem is common language. And, this was an area that here in Metro schools, we really needed to shore up. And it goes along with that, communicating professional expectations of data use. And we were fortunate to partner with REL Appalachia in helping us develop a common language. And I'm actually going to turn it over to Dr. Stephanie Wilkerson, who will talk about the technical assistance journey that we went through to develop a common language. So Stephanie?
Well, hi. Thank you, Margie. Actually, before I jump in, we have a couple of really great questions here that we've had from some of our listeners that, Margie, I think are pointed to you.
Okay.
We have one question about how frequently are the reports updated in the system?
Again, because we have programmers in-house, the reports are updated. Okay, well, let me answer. I think there's 2 answers you need to know. The reports are updated as data changes. For example, we went from one data system for response to intervention to another data system for response to intervention. So, our programmers had to work to update that. But then I was just thinking, what you might be asking is how often is the data uploaded? And basically our data systems are synced every night, which we have approximately a 50% mobility rate here in Metro Nashville Public Schools. And one of the uses our teachers, reported was if a student moves from one school to another, there was lag time between the physical cumulative record getting to them. Now, once that student is enrolled, so if that student's enrolled in my class today, then tomorrow I have access to their student records. So there's about a 24-hour lag time with that regard. I hope that answered your question. If not, keep asking until I get it right.
Thank you, Margie. And we have one more question. What staffing and monetary resources have been devoted to the development and ongoing maintenance of the district-wide dashboard system?
Yeah, so I know we have 2 programmers in terms of like servers and things of that nature. If you wanted to email me, and I'll put my email in the chat box, I could get you more specific details about that. That work was really done before I got to the district. But right now, pretty much we have 2 programmers that are on staff for that. And I'll put my email in the chat. If you want more information, I can get that for you.
All right. Thank you, Margie, and thank you those of you who have asked questions. Please keep them coming. We want to hear from you. So as Margie said, my name is Stephanie Wilkerson, and I'm with REL Appalachia. We started working with Metro Nashville back in 2014. And while Margie has spoken to kind of the data system and the warehouse for accessing early warning system data, what I'm speaking to today is about that common language piece for really nurturing a culture of data use. So it kind of speaks to that element that Nancy talked about before, providing leadership to nurture a culture of data use. And I'm going to speak to 3 practices that we engage groups in Metro Nashville for fostering that culture of data use. The first one is the root cause analysis to understand the problem. And when I mention problem, I'm referring to any barriers that are in a district to effective data use. We all use data, but are we using it effectively? And what are those barriers that are preventing us from effective data use? The second group process that we engage Metro Nashville educators in is developing logic models to define intended outcomes for collaborative inquiry. And then the third is developing innovation configuration maps. I'm going to talk about each of these separately to really describe what effective practices are. And thinking about the 5 elements that Nancy referenced, the logic model and innovation configure maps, they really are tools to communicate professional expectations for data use. So we used a fishbone, as you can tell by this visual, to engage a group of 40 in talking about what the barriers are to effective data use. A lot of times when we start working to build capacity around data use, we jump to the solution, the next best thing, the next best program, use this process. And we never really stop to ask ourselves, well, what's the problem that we're addressing to begin with? So because we were speaking to a culture of data use and not just a specific data use skill or practice, we began with the root cause analysis. And we looked at these different categories here of data collection and data use preparedness, all these different categories of things that might pose a barrier to effective data use. And we really focused our work on also collaborative inquiry. What are barriers to collaborative inquiry? And the group prioritized these as barriers. And what we found in this process, that key barriers that Metro Nashville wanted to prioritize and address included a lack of a common language, structures, protocols, and processes that guide how educators engage in collaborative inquiry. Also, a lack of trust when groups come together to discuss data and engage in the inquiry process. Sometimes it feels like very high stakes for teachers to put data at the center. And then another barrier that they identified was lack of leadership in the direction and the organizational support to support the follow-through of collaborative inquiry. So sometimes we can get things started, but it's that follow-through that really makes a difference in sustaining that culture of data use in a district. So with our root cause analysis, we asked the question, what are the barriers to using a collaborative inquiry approach for effective data use? We then asked ourselves, what outcomes would we expect to see if we implemented a collaborative inquiry process approach to data use without any barriers? So with that, we used logic models, and we developed one for each of the collaborative inquiry barriers that we identified, and we defined the short, intermediate, and long-term outcomes for implementing collaborative inquiry. So the logic models, they gave us a common language for where we want to go, but how will we get there? What are the practices that will help us achieve our outcomes, and do we have a common language and understanding about what those practices are? So moving from kind of this more abstract conceptualization of these data use practices, we then turn to develop an innovation configuration map to give us a very concrete description of what those practices are that would help us achieve the outcomes that we had defined in the logic models. So what you're looking at here is an example of one of the components of collaborative inquiry. This one focuses on using relevant data to drive decision making. So in its simplest form, the word innovation configuration map is a map. It's a word map. It tells you how to get to your destination of ideal implementation, showing various options along the way. So we used it to articulate the collaborative inquiry practices, and what you'll see here is an example of, if you start looking at level E, we talk about how a data team, a team of teachers, maybe grade level team, would only begin by relying on opinions and assumptions when making decisions. And then we move to looking at the next level, and they are they're considering some data to support making decisions. You move up a level, they're looking at multiple sources to analyze data before making a decision. Here you see that they're including quantitative and qualitative data to analyze. And then here in the ideal level of implementation under this particular dimension, you see that teams engage looking at multiple sources, quantitative and qualitative data to generate multiple possible solutions. So this is just an example. We have many components to the IC map, and if you want to learn more, there is there's going to be a link to an online video that will describe a little bit more about our use of the innovation configuration map in the District of Metro Nashville. And a couple things that I wanted to just point out here is, how does that IC map then turn around and support a culture of data use? You know, we're looking at how we work together to use data, right? So what the IC map does is it really provides that common language about the practices that you expect to see for outcomes to be realized. It also gives a continuum, so groups can self-assess where their starting point is and very concretely define the practices that would help them navigate toward higher and ideal levels of implementation. It also, one of the things about creating a culture of data use is that anybody could step into that culture, say a new teacher, and there would be languaging or tools or documentation that would help them understand what that culture is. So having a tool like an innovation configuration map helps everyone be on the same page with that common language, regardless of their experience or their position in the district. And this last slide, I know it's kind of hard to see, but the main emphasis here is it's a timeline, and it's to show that building a culture of data use takes time. It's systemic, it's proactive, it's intentional. In Metro Nashville, it started in 2014, and it's still going strong today in 2016 in building the capacity. We engaged at different levels and multiple perspectives in the district in our different group processes that I talked about, the fishbone and the logic models. We also engaged them in knowledge and skill building workshops around collaborative inquiry, around principal strategies for supporting data use. We did the innovation configurations as well. And the other thing is that we really decided to walk the talk in the district. So how do you know how you're using data in the district? Well, we evaluated. We're in the process of evaluating implementation of collaborative inquiry. So we're collecting data and using that to inform our decision making about next year's implementation of it. We also created a tool, the Teacher Data Use Survey, that will be coming out soon to measure teacher data use practices in the district. So as you can see in practice, fostering a culture of data use takes time. It's incremental. And to share how this work has played out in practice, I'm happy to turn this over to the principal of Haynes Middle School, Dr. Henderson, for discussion about school use of early warning system data to develop a school-wide program that address needs identified in the data.
Good afternoon. Again, I'm Canidra Henderson, and I will try to address really what happens at the school level when you're talking about supports for early warning systems and data use, and really how it translates. Just to give you an idea about our school and just to share some demographics, our school and a lot of the information has shifted even since we have started this work. We initially, this is my first, I'm completing, last year was my first full year at Haynes Metal Design Center, so I'm going into my second full year here, and my sixth in the district working. Here we started off at 285 students. This year we have grown to 300 students in grades 5 through 8. We have 12 content area teachers, 5 related arts teachers. Last year we went from 2 exceptional ed teachers, and I can say that due to a lot of the work that you will hear me discuss, we have doubled in our EE population for this calendar year. So, you know, a lot of wraparound support in a lot of areas. So we're located in the North Nashville area. It's considered the Bordeaux area. 97% of our students are on free and reduced lunch, and we are a PIDEA learning school, but our specialty focus is health and medical science. So that just kind of gives you a little bit of context of who we are as a school. Now, when you look at, you know, just the overall, when we were first introduced to the process and we thought about ways that it could help us, how could it help us to use data? When we started off, we would typically give our faculty members data. We would analyze it. We would give it to them so that they could kind of see, okay, what are the trends? We would give them some time to discuss aha moments. The problem was always identified pretty much at the higher level. Teachers didn't necessarily have input, context. They didn't really know how to look at the data and determine a little bit deeper what the issues were. So using the model that is laid out on this slide, what our goal was to move into a system where teachers really owned the process for analyzing data. They use their own focus, inquiry questions to be able to kind of talk through every problem of practice that we had pretty much in the school. It allowed the teachers to, you know, say what was important to them, and that was a big part of really identifying what will be the area that we will focus on just as a school. So Margie brought data to analyze key important elements, and we would just kind of talk through the practices. The teachers then analyzed and came up with solutions that were focused on whole school as opposed to just what was going on in their class. A lot of the original conversation when you're, you know, initially when we talked about, you know, just what are our problems of practice, it was always very classroom-centered, very student individual focused. So, you know, we wanted to really look at making a whole school change based on the EWS indicators that were proactive as opposed to reactive. So, you know, we had to first really kind of norm our common language in the building and determine, okay, what's going to be the language? What does consistency mean? What does it look like? What does it sound like? So starting in March, we focused on just getting teachers involved in the data process and what we consider and what we found to be a little bit more effective. So Margie kind of talked about district-wide having the big warehouse. Well, you know, we saw what we recognized and realized that on the school level, the teachers, that was kind of overwhelming to them. So we wanted to kind of change up the protocol, and we came to the conclusion that we needed to start earlier just establishing the culture and really developing that common language and using this as a process of organizing our meetings. So we structured meetings so that teachers would be able to have full autonomy of what they wanted to focus on. So we kind of took the quantitative data out of the picture and allowed teachers to really find areas. So each grade level team came up with an area to focus on, and it just coincidentally was the same across all 4 grade levels, which worked well, you know, for us to be able to really talk and establish planning sessions to determine, okay, what's a new way of looking and working on the work. So, you know, with our particular model, because we are such a small school, we only have one content teacher per grade level. So there's no way of really looking at assessment data, and comparing it, because each teacher is pretty much comparing it to themselves. So, teachers were able to, using this process, recognize that there were inconsistent messages and methods around student behaviors. One of the early warning system indicators, and this was the area that, number one, we as a school needed to make sure that data needed attention, and also where we as a school needed to really develop more consistent approaches to how we supported students and develop appropriate behavior. So, more proactive versus reactive. So, you can look at state assessment data, but one thing that our teachers were just adamant about was that's done, but we're still having issues in our classrooms every day that we're not really addressing because we're only looking at the quantitative. So what you are looking at now are some of the data pieces that we collected. So it doesn't look very traditional in a sense of, the normal charts like Margie kind of shared with you where you look at the flags. Now, of course, that was data that, as the executive principal, the administrative team, we were able to look at that. But actually moving from that culture of compliance and getting, teachers more in tune to the collaborative learning cycle and the inquiry cycle was one of the things that we thought was helpful. So what's important to know about data sources is that they don't have to come from data warehouse in order for it to be effective. So we have a structured time that last year we called them Tuesday Talks that allowed teachers to focus regularly on data use and the cycle. So that is pretty much what you see teachers who worked and developed, what are those patterns, what are those trends, and, even something as small as looking at, buzzwords, what was our own common language. So then we moved and kind of shifted a little bit to be able to bring in and explore some of the data that was provided through this entire process. So here would be an example of once teachers came up with their own individual data. This is information that they wanted to see from the data warehouse. And this helped them to learn more about, okay, now that we see some trends, here's what, we see as some common areas. Now what does it look like at Haynes? So, this allowed them to now bring in the quantitative data and determine that. So from there, teachers continue to just discuss the data, and this happened over sessions. So of course this was the process that happened when we did this, but the collaborative process that was used was really the general idea, and the big question that emerged was, how do we as a school support SEL and self-regulatory behaviors in the classroom? So, this allowed us to really organize what the work would look like. And of course, because we were starting this process in February, March, and in April, it allowed us to really kind of put a plan in place that we would take all the way through the summer and be able to start off the new year with. So, when you look at just the overall summary ideas from Haynes, when you talk about the practices that moved data from, I would say the principal's office to at least getting down to the team levels, was really, having a group of individuals that were committed to the culture of collaborative inquiry. And that had to happen at the entire school had to really commit to that. The teachers also developed strategies to promote teacher ownership and data use. So we used the groups that work model. Teachers identified areas of concern based on their knowledge and expertise. So it was less about what we told them the problem was, and it was more about what they saw as the problems from their viewpoint, from their vantage point. Data inquiries were collected. Teachers worked together to analyze the data, and then they worked to develop what the system-wide plans would be. So much to, we even changed when we talk about just having a school-wide discipline plan. We even felt as though common language was so important that we changed the word discipline to say behavior. So, a lot of those things we just found were important in the work. So, when we're talking about, the key concepts around what has shifted as we have changed the way that we use data at Haynes, before pretty much data was given by administrators, for every specific area. It was reactive. Okay, what are we going to do about this data? Individual classroom data was pretty much isolated. Response was only geared to a few students, and it was truly a culture of compliance. So what we are really using is this collaborative inquiry process to really help teachers to realize that, it's really about what they need. It has to be proactive. The response is to really support and provide early warning and intervention for as many students as we possibly can. And at the heart and the core of it is really creating a culture of collaboration and centered around data use. So that was the main goal. When we talk about the actual process that we went through, and a lot of this is important because as we have brought on new faculty members, they are able to really kind of pick up and keep things going. So in our Tuesday talks, teachers went through a 4-session process of discovering what they as grade level teams and ultimately us as a school wanted to, or what we considered the most important focus for the upcoming year. So teachers focused on the whole notion of social and emotional learning and how to support student self-regulatory behaviors, both in the classroom, in the school, just in life. And so what we did was, from a leadership standpoint, you have to really commit to the process as a whole. And so, you have to support that teacher-driven inquiry. You have to provide time and structure for collaborative inquiry. Teachers were forced to, before looking at just grade level data, kind of came up with their own systems, and they came up that they felt like could provide support to each other, not just from an academic standpoint. So we had to kind of bring it down from the numbers. The innovation configuration map provided a self-reflection tool that helped all of the teachers really kind of focus on, what's going to be the main areas that we're going to focus on. It helped them to have a tool to hold others accountable for the work, the language, and just kind of the way we operate just as a school. Teachers went on to really move from the practice of focusing on individual students and behaviors to really, really exploring, okay, what can we do as a school, and focused a lot of the conversation on group work. So even, I look at the way that we started off our professional development this school year. Teachers were able to come together, and proactively we determined that we want to focus on communication. And so they were able to dialogue about that, and they felt comfortable in exploring data, not necessarily defensive about, stepping on toes or saying something that was going to be the wrong thing, but they not only were able to notice trends over time, but they connected those trends to what happened in their classrooms. So when we talk about that, the social emotional learning and the self-regulatory, they were able to get it. And it was not them being necessarily told, it was them recognizing, hey, this problem may be a little bit more than what we think and what the numbers may say on the surface. So what we did, from that point was just begin to act on the needs that were identified by the teachers. We immediately put in place a dean of students who is supporting just the social and emotional arm of the school. We created a position that was a social and emotional learning position and created a team that specifically focused on social emotional learning and the component that would shift from the discipline to behavior and how we support students and getting other both district level and just other levels of support wrapped around the teachers so that we could give them what they needed. We scheduled development for the beginning of the school year, and from there we were able to at least recognize and see that a shift had truly occurred with us and the work. Now we can kind of shift a little bit and talk a little bit about the strategies for developing a culture of data use to support your own specific EWS system.
Thank you, Canidra. And so I wish folks could see the paper of notes that I've taken as we move into these next slides. I was trying to document some of the practices, and you'll see here that we have practices listed for each of the areas of the framework, and there were so many that I know that you'll be able to communicate many of these as well as we go through. So in the next 10 minutes, we're going to have a chat discussion, and I'm going to frame some topics that came out. Thank you, Jenny, for making the chat a little bit bigger so we can see what folks are writing. And the two key questions here, and Kayleen, if you would be willing to put these into the chat so people can refer to them when we advance the slides, that would be great. The first is, what are some leverage points through which to enter this work? So many of you come as district school level folks, and many of you are supporting data work through different teams and through guidance and other leadership roles that I saw. Or some of you are on here on this webinar as teachers, a very different kind of entry points and thinking about where to come into this work based on your role. So we're interested in some thoughts about that. And then also, what are some next steps that you might be considering as you listen to the Nashville presentation about the framework as a whole? What are some next steps you might be considering for your site as we move forward? And so please feel free to just think and write as we're continuing these next 10 minutes of discussion about this. What we've done here is we have 5 slides, and each one of these slides highlights some things that were embedded in our original planning discussions with Metro Nashville. Some of these are things that came up high volume in today's presentation, and some things a little lower volume, and there were lots of things that are added to this list, which is why I have lots of notes in front of me. So I want to just use this as an opportunity to go through the framework one more time from the perspective of some strategies that Nashville took to really build out each one of these 5 elements. And again, it's a process. They're still in that process, but helping to consider that frame. So in this first element, participating in the flow of information for evidence use, we heard this idea that Dr. Johnson identified of differentiating factors in the data warehouse. In other words, making the data warehouse very supportive of others in the system, and really, for instance, in the last one, revising data analysis reporting based on the changing needs of educators. So having people who are able to respond to queries, are able to think about what data would be useful for teachers, and are able to organize the data at the right layer for different users. You heard Dr. Johnson talk about establishing partnerships with experts and really helping to identify what are our early warning indicators, what are the things that we can measure in real-time data that we have, so it's not what we call in the field autopsy data, but it really is organized around current data that users of that information would value. And then what are the what was very powerful in the national presentation was the notion of starting out by meeting with educators to determine their data needs as a starting point. And the research is very clear about this, that in this notion of organizing a data system, and again, not everybody has them. I live in New Hampshire and work in lots of rural schools where this is actually a myth. You know, there isn't money or resource for this. But in urban systems and suburban systems where those systems exist, or for school districts that are building off of their state EWS systems, having the opportunity to really organize around developing those early warning indicators with data that is valued in the system is important, and we heard about it in Nashville. As we move down the left column, continuing to talk about this idea of communication and setting professional expectations, we heard all 3 Nashville folks talk about this in different ways. And as particularly interested in some of the work. So the over-the-counter data standards were one way that this was talked about, and that link was put up in the chat. So that's a place to really clarify from a large picture level what are some things that we think are most important. And the innovation configuration maps were another way to say, at the teacher level, at the team level of practice, here are some things that we can do together. And the fact that that was built inside Nashville, that folks were involved with that and had an opportunity to really think that through, was a really innovative strategy for thinking about this particular piece, where we hear again and again in the research one of the barriers to data use at the school level is that people aren't really sure what is expected of them or what data they're going to use or how they're going to use that. So this makes that very clear. Nashville also talked about sort of multiple communication models that they developed in the early parts of this work, and organizing around how you communicate to 160 different school settings using the systems that you have in place and organizing for that. Going up to the right column, providing resources and assistance to make meaning from data. There was a great frame that Dr. Wilkerson gave for us about thinking about moving from the abstract on the left side to the concrete on the right side with the innovation configuration map offering a lens for that groups can self-assess what resources they need and what they can do to try on practices with an understanding, which is so powerful in this work, that this is a process. We heard all three speakers talk about the fact that this takes a significant period of time. The notion in place about districts and school leaders collaboratively supporting teachers to use the findings from the EWS system as a start was particularly powerful in this regard with Dr. Henderson's frame of what happened at Haynes, which is so exciting that you don't necessarily have to start a collaborative inquiry process with a set of data in front of you. And one of the things we know about data use is that when you put a data set in front of teachers and you say, go analyze that, without an inquiry question, we see very little action. So the step of helping teachers really think about and develop a collaborative inquiry process and developing their questions even before they necessarily see the data gives an honor and value to the work that's being done. And that structure that goes into place then, the structure that Dr. Henderson spoke about being available to teachers last year at Haynes Middle, is an opportunity for teachers to use that time well, even when we know that in some places those structures don't hold value. By using the collaborative inquiry, it engaged the teachers at a very rich level, giving them the ownership of having that kind of assistance and making meaning time. As we think then about the providing professional development, we heard the absolutely sort of clear-cut ideal link that Dr. Henderson spoke of, specifically with the way that they provided professional development for the results of what teachers came up with in their inquiry process. So in this case, looking out over the data over a period of time in the spring, making concrete decisions about what as a school they're going to do. Here are our highest markers: social emotional learning issue, discipline issues. How are we going to think about that? Because most of our students are flagged, right? Or many of our students are flagged. This is not just an individual student responsiveness issue now. This is an issue that we collectively have to find better ways to address. And so holding on to that and thinking about the professional development and support that goes with that is part of what I mentioned earlier, and building that deep capacity for improved content knowledge and improved pedagogical knowledge that teachers need to do this kind of work effectively in a consistent way across the school, and to share that language and knowledge around that work. And finally, we heard strategies around leadership from all three of our presenters. And I want to mention this specifically. The research points very strongly to both a top-down and bottom-up approach that's absolutely required to do data use well. And though those words weren't used, we heard this very thoughtful relationship that is in place in Nashville between the district work that's being done, the school level work that's being done, and the teacher level work that's being done. And that both and, the top-down and bottom-up, they're both equally important in the leadership models for good, effective culture of data use practices. So on the bottom-up side, we see more distributed leadership amongst teachers, more teacher leadership roles helping to support this work, coaches and other teacher leaders who can step up to the plate on some of this work. At the school level, we see in the leadership piece and the research, it's very clear what Dr. Henderson talked to us about today is a very strong part of the research to say that one of the primary responsibilities of principals is to filter those accountability markers that can kind of upset the apple cart at the school level, to filter any messages that come in that are primarily around, I think Dr. Henderson used the word compliance, to shift that so that the messages are about students and improvement and our collective practice. And we've really heard that and there were a lot of different mechanisms in place to support that around the collaborative inquiry process itself, giving teachers ownership of that time and letting them come to decisions about the most important areas of work in their school, and yet at the same time providing them with lots of structure to do that so that those conversations were focused on improving rather than proving, right, and hoping and building capacity to organize this. So I've been looking down in the chat, and I haven't seen many things that are related to these specific strategies that you might try, the chat question there. But I do see some questions that I actually, in just a moment, I'm going to turn over to I'll read the question and see who would like to do that. But I think, Dr. Johnson, these will be yours. But let me just go back to this question. Let me go back to this question about these strategies. Our goal for this webinar was to give all of you an opportunity to explore this framework a little bit and then have a chance to think about how a district might be engaged with all 5 of these at one time, how a school might be engaged with all 5 of these elements together, and a teacher's experience of that as a member of a data team and working towards school improvement using early warning system data as a starting point for that work. And so I hope you leave today with a sense of some entry points for your work. One of the things that this framework intentionally does not do is it does not offer strategies within these. And one of the reasons that's the case is that we really, from a research perspective, we're not quite sure what all of those strategies are. We know that, or I would say even more importantly, we're not sure the progression of development of those strategies. So we know some core things in each of these that are outlined in the framework, but each district is responsible for thinking of those entry points on their own and to develop some strategic decisions, some pathways towards meeting all 5 of these elements. And so this conversation is kind of an open conversation still, knowing that there's lots more research to do in this area, and yet many of us in practice are ahead of that research, right? We're doing many of these things. So as you think about and organize for this presentation and think about the follow-up, that framing of how you might move forward in organizing for each of these 5 things, the toolkit that we showed in the beginning might help, but also just looking at those 5 and really analyzing from your own perspective. Where are we strong? Where do we need work? And where could we go to get some information to support that, hoping that this was one of those. So I am going to turn to the questions now, and one of the questions I'm going to turn over to Margie, which is, how did you determine the thresholds for the early warning system flags? And then I think there's a question for Dr. Henderson, and then we'll come back to me to close it up. Margie?
Yes, so the thresholds were determined as a result of our partnership with Dr. Balfonts at Johns Hopkins University, and I actually just posted a link. I think that document there speaks more about that particular study. I was not part of the study, but our research assessment and evaluation department worked with him and analyzed years of our data, and there's even a percentage, and I don't remember right offhand the percentage, but I mean, if you have 1 at-risk flag, then your percentage rate to graduate drops, and of course 2 at-risk, it goes down, and 3, it just continues to go down based on the number of at-risk flags that you have. And again, they used our data to determine what those thresholds were for us.
Thank you, Margie. And I think the last question is, can each teacher access the early warning system, or does administration share the information? And Margie, can you handle that one as well?
Yes, so our data warehouse, everyone in our district has access to the data warehouse, and then they have access to the data based on their role. So teachers have reports that have data for the students that are in their classes, so they can, basically we have all the reports. Everyone has access to every report, but your ability to, to see certain data points is based on your security role. So teachers could pull up a dashboard for their classroom and see early warning indicators for the students in their classes. And then, of course, the school can see the school-wide, and then at the district level, we're able to see the district level, and then we can access any school. So teachers do have access to our data warehouse. I will tell you that, and even working with the Haynes teachers, and I really won't go into our data warehouse unless I have a question to be answered, because if you go in without a targeted question, it gets overwhelming really fast. So it was great that they went through this process of collaborative inquiry by identifying behavior. That was the data they wanted to look at. Then that helped us narrow down the reports that were analyzed for, the next part of the work.
Thank you, Margie. As we wrap up, I just want to share a couple of slides with you. We have pushed out some information into the chat, but we also have these resources that we pushed out into the chat available right here, so that if you download the slides, you'll have those links as well. And we encourage you to go to those sites. There's I'm just going to step back. There's a very interesting and helpful piece that I believe Dr. Wilkerson mentioned around the innovation configuration map that I just wanted to raise up again, which is a short video on how to design an innovation configuration map. So if that's something that you're interested in more information, that might be a very good starting point for you. We are eager to continue this conversation, and so I have included all of our emails there, and please, we look forward to hearing from you and hearing about the work that you're doing. It helps all of us improve and think about how to make this work as strong as it can be for our teachers and for our students. So I appreciate hearing from you if it works out to do so, as do others. And then you'll notice also on this that we have the reference for the toolkit that we mentioned earlier, and also there's a nice book, How to Make Data Work, a guide for educational leaders, that Dr. Johnson has some excerpts in, so it'd be helpful for you to take a look at that if you'd like to learn more about the work that's being done there in Nashville. And so I'm going to turn this over to Rebby, and it's all yours. Thank you, everybody, for participating. It's been a pleasure sharing this with you, and thank you to our national presenters for sharing their good work that they're doing on this.
I'd just like to echo our thanks to you, Nancy, and to Margie, Canidra, and Stephanie for that fascinating, very informative. My notes are also filled up. I would like to mention that everybody will receive a thank you email in a couple of weeks that will have a link to the archive. So if you have a colleague who is not able to make this event, please feel free to share that. And also, please stay on and complete the survey that we will be that will come up. We love to hear your feedback and use it to improve our future events. So thank you all for attending, and thanks to the presenters. Have a lovely afternoon.